Bright Tuty. Every student matters.
Hi students, welcome to the session. In this session, we are going to start with the new chapter, that is cell, structure and function. So in this chapter, we are going to discuss about the cell, which is said to be the structural and functional unit of life. Now we all know all the organisms are made up of we all know all the organisms are made up of one or several cells, right? You also know that for the survival of the human beings or any other animal, there are certain life processes that need to be carried out. These life processes are usually nutritional requirements, the respiration, transportation, and so on. So basically, how does this process takes place in the various body parts? And we know that all these processes are performed by the organs and organ systems in human beings and in all animals like dog, cats, and so on. Basically, what happens is that different organs are able to perform different functions, right? We have already studied about how the digestive system has different organs, and within the digestive system itself, there are different parts which are performing different functions, like glands, and then you have your small intestine, large intestine. Both of these are performing different functions. Now, have you ever wondered that how is the small intestine, is performing different function, whereas the large intestine is performing different function? The reason for that is the cell that it is made up of, right? So, cell becomes, you can say that this cell is the structural unit of an organ. That means that what kind of cell is present in an organ decides the function of the organ, right? The shape of the cell, the function that it performs, basically dictates the kind of organ that will be formed. Now, if you remember, when we were studying about small intestine, we saw that on the inner walls of the small intestine there was villi, right? And those villi were further, when we magnified them, it was made up of microvilli, right? And if we take a slice of the microvilli and we observe it, we will find it is made up of small units called as the cell, right? So this is why we say that cell is the structural unit of the organ. You can understand it by comparing it to a brick, right? This brick is used to make a room, right? And then the room is used, different room come together to make a whole building, right? So in this way, we see that how the cell is acting as the structural unit and can be to an extent compared to brick to understand that how it is the structural unit of an organism, right? Now, before we move on any further and study about the cell and its structure and function, let's talk about the discovery of cell, right? So cells are the basic building blocks of life. Cells may be in different shapes, sizes, and can vary in number, right? That means within an organism, it can be of different shapes, it can be of different size, and it can vary in number. That means in one organism there might be different number of cells, whereas on the other hand, in different organisms there may be different number of cells. Why is it called as the building block of life? Because it is the structural unit of body, right? So it is the structural unit of the body, and that's why it is called as the building block of life. Now, when we talk about discovery of cell, there was a scientist his name was Robert Hooke, and in 1665 he observed the bark or slice of a cork and discovered the cell. What exactly was he doing was he had developed a magnifying device, right? And he was testing as to how different things look under the magnifying device and how much magnification can take place. So what he did was he took a cork, right? So cork is basically part of the bark of a tree, right? So he took the cork and he cut a very thin slice of the cork and kept it under the magnifying device, and he observed it, right? The magnifying device which he had fashioned was quite simple in the design, and when he observed that cork, what he found was the structures like this. It was looking like a honeycomb structure, right? It looked like a honeycomb like structure, and you can see the similarity when I say honeycomb and when he also thought that honeycomb. So you can see how it looks similar with various partitions and compartments that are present. So when he observed this honeycomb like structure, he also saw that this whole structure was made up of boxes, right? So you can see that one box he saw was separated by other because of a certain wall or a partition, right? So this he called as the cell, right? So this partition or these boxes he called as cell, right? Because these are a compartment like structure, they were room like structure basically. That's the reason why he coined the term cell. So Robert Hooke not only discovered the cell, but he also coined the term cell. Why did he coin this term? Because the structure that he saw in this particular cork was a honeycomb like structure, where he was able to see that one of the boxes or the cells were divided from each other or separated from each other with the walls, right? So apart from that, he observed that these cells were actually dead cells, right? And because of this discovery, further and further developments started taking place, where the improvement in microscopes started happening. That means the magnifying device, which was very simple, that was designed by Robert Hooke, people started working on that device and invented new and more powerful microscopes, and with the help of those microscopes, living cells were discovered. Then further, more and more of the parts of the cells were discovered, because the magnifying power increased, and the scientists were able to look inside those compartments that were coined as the cell, and they were able to see what are the different parts of that cell, right? So now because of this microscope, or rather you should say because of the microscopes that are present nowadays, which have very high magnifying powers, because of those microscopes we are able to study the whole structure and function of the cell, right? But the credit goes to Robert Hooke, because he was the first person to discover the cell, and also he was the one who coined this term that we are using now, in our daily studies nowadays, right? So in this way, the discovery of cell was made, and always remember, the first discovery of cell was of the dead cell, right? And later on, Leeuwenhoek was the one who discovered the living cell, and those were the bacterial cells, right? So this was how the discovery of cell was made. So basically, when we talk about cell, it is the structural unit of your body, right? Cell in the living organisms are complex living structures. Why do we call them as complex living structures? Because whatever life processes an individual is performing, that is, say your, the nutrition process, the respiration process, the excretion, and so many other things that a human being is performing, or any living organism is performing to sustain life, it is seen in the cell as well, right? So we also observe the similar kind of processes, that is your nutrition. We also see respiration, right? We also see different other life processes that are performed by the cell. That is why we call it as the complex living structure, right? Because these show all the characteristics of a living organism, right? Then why do we call it complex? Because again, we'll study further in this chapter that it is made up of different parts which perform distinct functions, right? Also in in one particular organism itself, there are number of cells that are present, and they have distinct shape and sizes, and also they differ in numbers. When we call as this is how we call the cell as the functional unit, right? This is your functional unit. Now another term that we use for the cell is the structural unit. Why do we call it the structural unit? Now if you look at the image over here, we are able to see a brick wall, and we are also able to see an onion peel, right? So this is a microscopic view of the onion peel, and if you observe, you will find certain similarities. What are those similarities? That over here the wall is made up of a single brick, right? So what is happening, what we can see over here is that the wall is made up of single bricks, one after the other bricks that are put together. Similarly, if we look at this particular onion peel, we see that it is made up of a single cell, and that is repeating itself, right? So in brick wall as well as in the cell, in the tissue of a human being, we can observe, or even in the plants, like you can see that this is an onion peel, we can observe that the onion peel is made up of a single cell, and the brick wall is also is made up of one brick, that is one brick after the other brick, and similarly it happens in the onion peel also. So that is why we call it as the structural unit. That means that beginning is from a single cell, which is further one after the other they get joined, and they are able to build the tissues, and from the tissues the organs are formed, right? So similarity between the brick wall and we see between the onion peel is that both have a structural unit. In this case, brick is the structural unit, whereas in the onion peel we see that the cell is the structural unit, right? Now if we talk about the cell, I already told you that in human beings, if we talk about not only in human beings but also in plants, even in other animals, there are different organs in the body, and these organs have different cells, right? All these cells are different in these organs, and what we observe is that each organ is made up of cells only, right? So although we can make a comparison between a building and an organism, we see that different shapes of buildings are achieved by the cell bricks only, right? So brick is the basic unit of buildings, and different shapes are achieved by it. Similar is the case with your onion peel also, or any other organism also, that cells are cells come together, they form a tissue, and then they form the organ, and they differ from one organ to the other, right? So cell structure also differs from one organ to the other. Some of the shape of the cell is quite different depending on again the type of function that they perform, right? So this is again justifying the structural unit that we call the cell, right? Now, like I said, it is the living structure, and it is a complex living structure, whereas on the other hand, brick we know is a non-living thing, right? So in this way we understand that how the cell is the functional and the structural unit of life. Now there is a question that Paheli wants to ask, that a hen's egg can be seen easily. Is it a cell or a group of cells? So hen's egg, although it can be seen easily, it is a single cell. So all the eggs that we are able to observe, right, be it an ostrich's egg. So ostrich's egg is the largest cell that we are able to see, right? So the ostrich egg is an example of a single cell, and it is the largest cell, right? So hen's egg, ostrich egg, even the eggs of human beings, which we will study later, that how there is an egg in the human being also, which is the beginning of the life, right? Which is one of the part of the beginning of the life. So that is also a single cell, right? So in this way, we see that there are certain cells that we can actually visualize without the use of microscopes, and those are the eggs of different birds and fishes, right? So now, once we have understood this was a simple introduction as to what is cell and why do we call it the structural and functional unit. Different type of variety of cell number, shape and size, right? So in different organisms we see a different variety of cell number. That means they're depending on the size of the animals, the cell number usually varies. The shape of the cells and size. Shape and size of the cell although do not depend on the organism, it actually depends on the kind of function that the cell is performing, right? So now there are millions of living organisms, including the plants and animals, right? So we know that plants are really small and some of the plants are huge. These trees are really huge, and similarly in animals also we see some of the animals are really small, whereas other animals are they're huge like a whale, right? So depending on the living organism, that how big the living organism is, their number vary. The cell number varies in them. Apart from that, we also see that the plants and animals, or the living organism for that matter, have different shapes and sizes. And that's why their organs also have different shape, size and the number of cells, right? And this variety is seen in all the diverse living organisms that are present on the planet Earth, right? When we talk about shape and size of a cell, it usually depends on the function, right? So what kind of function the cell is playing, this is how, this shape and size of the cell is dependent and not on the size of the organism. But definitely when we talk about the number of cells, it depends on the organism also. If we talk about the organs within an organism, we also see that the number vary from your organ to organ. Suppose if there is an organ that is, for example, when we say liver, we know that liver is a large organ, right? It's a large gland. So we can, when we compare it with, say, salivary gland, we know that in liver we will find more of the cells as compared to the salivary gland. So in this way, this also shape of the organ, the shape of the organ, their size is also affecting the number of cells in that, right? So in this session, we are going to talk about the different shape, size and number of cells, right? How do they vary within the organisms, and how do they vary through the wide range of the animals and plants that we see. So moving ahead, when we talk about the observation of the cell, when I say that we know or we are studying about shape and size and even the number, shape, size and number of the cell, before we understand all of this, one thing which we need to do is observation of the cell. How do we observe the cell? If you remember, when we were talking about the discovery of the cell, what the scientist Robert Hooke did was that he cut a very thin slice of the cork and simply observed it under the microscope. He was not able to see all the different parts of the cell, because first of all the cell was dead. But in the case of when the microscope started evolving, there were certain techniques which were utilized to improve the observation of the cell. One such technique is staining, right? So this is a technique where dyes are used, right? Dyes are used for observation purposes. What exactly happens is, say for example, if I have to look at the onion peel, right? As you can see, this is an onion peel, and when I have to observe it, what I'll do is I'll take say a chemical, a dye, say for example safranin or methylene blue, and I will put a single drop of that on the sample that I need to observe, right? Once I do that, what will happen? Some part of the sample will pick up the color, whereas others will not. This will help in observing in detail these different shapes, different shape of the cell, and also it will help in distinguishing one cell from the other. Apart from that, it also helps in indicating the different parts of the cell. As you can see over here, this part is the nucleus. We are going to study about this part of the cell further in this chapter, but for now it is important for us to understand that for the observation purposes, when we need to observe a cell, it is very important for us to stain it, right, using different kinds of dyes, because once we dye it, the different parts of the cell become more apparent, right? It becomes easier for us to observe these different parts and the shape and size of the cell, right? Now, once we have understood about this, let's now talk about the number of cells. As we know, there are different organisms on our earth, and they vary in shapes and sizes. When we talk about number of cell, it depends on the type of organisms, right? What kind of organism are we looking at? And that's how we will see that what will be the number of cells. If we compare the number of cells from human body to any other organism, we will see there is a large difference between the two. If we talk about, say, human body itself, so in human body we have trillions of cells, right? So it's a huge number, right? So it has how many trillions of cells? Trillions of cells, right? So human body is quite you can say it's a huge it's a huge body when you compare it with a smaller body, say a rat. When you compare a human body with the elephant, again the number of the cell increases. When you compare that elephant with the whale, then again the number of cell increases. So basically the size of the organism, right, size of the organism also organism also influences, right, the number of cells, right? The cells that are present, different group of cells that are present, they perform different functions. Not all the cells are, you can say, performing the same function, because the shape and size of the cell also varies, which we will study that how this varies. For now, let's understand that different group of cells perform varied functions, right? And usually the organisms having many cells are called as the multicellular organisms. As the name suggests, these organisms have multiple cells, right? Multicellular organisms. So these have how many? These have multiple cells, right? So human beings are the example of multicellular organisms, and we have dog, we have cats, right? These all are usually the example of the multicellular organism. Now, interesting point to note over here is that all the multicellular organisms begin their journey from a single cell, right? That means the multicellular organism are formed from the single cell called as the zygote, right? And this is what it is, the fertilized egg, right? So this is a single cell, it is the fertilized egg through which the journey of the multicellular organism begins. This single cell, suppose this is the single cell, it divides into 2 cells, then it further divides into 4 cells, right? And then so on and so forth, leading up to the formation of the multicellular organism. So basically the journey of a multicellular organism begins from the single fertilized egg, right, which is also known as the zygote. So in this way we see that how over here this point also you can say substantiates or gives evidence as to how a cell is the structural unit of the living organism, because the journey of living organism begins with a single cell which keeps on dividing and differentiating to form a whole organism. So this is all about the multicellular organisms. There are certain organisms which are unicellular, means they are made up of single cell, right? Now, if you remember, we were talking about the organisms when we were talking about cells, we said that the cell had the capability to perform all the life processes that were important to sustain life. This is one of the examples as to how a single cell is able to perform all the functions that are necessary to maintain life. These organisms, which are made up of only one cell, are called as the unicellular organisms. Now, if we look at the example over here, we have paramecium. This is a paramecium. And this over here is an amoeba, right? Both of these are unicellular organisms and they perform all the functions from nutrition to your reproduction. That means they are they are taking in nutrition, they are excreting, they are reproducing, they are respirating, they are also moving from one place to the other, right? So in this way we see the unicellular organisms are the organisms that are made up of single cells, right? Made up of single cells, right? So in this way we see how the unicellular organism is quite different from the multicellular organism. Multicellular organisms are made up of large number of cells, whereas unicellular organism, as the name suggests, is made up of single cell, right? So like I already told you, the unicellular organisms are able to perform all the functions that are performed by the multicellular organisms. Here only one cell is at action. But if we look at the multicellular organisms like your human beings, we see that these cells which we saw were dividing, they divide and they form tissues, right? Cells, they divide and they form tissues. So what are the tissues? These are the group of cells that are similar in structure and perform similar functions, right? And these tissues come together to form an organ, right? So in this way we see that how the function is happening inside the human beings or a multicellular organism, where the cells form the group that are tissue and the organs are formed which perform the functions of nutrition, respiration, reproduction, transportation and excretion, right? So all of this happens because of the different cells that are coming together. And that is one of the other differences of your unicellular organism and multicellular, that in the multicellular organism the organizational level is quite larger as compared to the your unicellular organism. The reason is quite clear, because it has only a single cell, right? Now next, what we can do, this activity is something which can be demonstrated by your teacher. Why we are doing this activity is to get a little better understanding about the structure of the unicellular organisms. You can ask your teacher to show you the permanent slides of amoeba and your paramecium. Over here also, students, if you look, this is something which you will visualize, that this is a single cell organism, that is amoeba and paramecium. And over here also, if you notice that there is pink color, that means there has been staining, right? That means these cells, these unicellular organisms have been stained for your better observation, right? So with this particular activity, first of all, you will be able to appreciate the structure of the unicellular organism, and also on the other hand, you will be able to understand the importance of staining, right? In this session, we are going to talk about the shape of the cell. In the previous session, we talked about the number of the cell, and we saw, based on the number, we divided the cell into multicellular organisms and unicellular organisms. Now, when we were talking about unicellular organism, we talked about a particular organism called as the amoeba. Now, if you remember the shape of the amoeba, what would you call it to be? You will say that the shape of the amoeba was quite irregular, and that's a correct answer. So basically, amoeba's shape is quite irregular. The reason for this is that amoeba is able to change its shape according to the requirement. Basically, amoeba has no definite shape unlike the other organisms. If we talk about the same unicellular organism, that is your paramecium, we know that amoeba is also a unicellular organism, right? Amoeba is also a unicellular organism, and similarly we saw that paramecium was also a unicellular organism, but the shape of paramecium was fixed. It was slipper like. But in the case of amoeba, this is not the case. It is irregular, and the amoeba can change its shape, right? Can change Amoeba can change its shape, right? So you can see that it is irregular shape, and amoeba has the ability of changing its shape. Now these projections which you are able to see, these are called as the pseudopodia, right? So these projections that you are able to see are known as the pseudopodia. Now the name pseudopodia means false feet, right? So pseudo means false and podia means feet. So pseudopodia is something which emerges, these are finger-like projections which emerges from the body of the amoeba for two purposes. First purpose is for the movement, that is locomotion from one place to the other, and other purpose is to capture its prey. Whenever the amoeba sees a food particle that is near its body, the pseudopodia are projected out, and somewhat this kind of function, this kind of process takes place where the pseudopodia are projected out of the body and they engulf its prey, right, creating a food vacuole. Regarding this, you have already studied when we were talking about digestion in your previous classes, right? For now, it's important for us to understand that pseudopodia are something which are used for two functions. First is the movement and other is the capture of the prey. Now, because the amoeba doesn't have irregular shape, because the amoeba doesn't have a particular fixed shape, these are very, very important parts. These projections play a very important role, and once the amoeba is done with the feeding, and once maybe amoeba stops moving, these projections are completely removed. That means the body of the amoeba becomes like this. That means there is no pseudopodia seen in this particular amoeba, right? So once the function is done, the amoeba is you can say disappears, right? So this protruding out of the pseudopodia is you can say a benefit of having an irregular shape, because this allows the amoeba to perform various functions, right? Now, when we talk about this amoeba's shape, there is a question that Paheli has a problem with, and what is that problem? That she wants to know what advantages does amoeba derive by changing the shape. So as we know that with the help of changing the shape, the amoeba can create pseudopodia, right? And pseudopodia, as I already explained, is false feet which helps in the movement and capturing of the food, right? So this is the advantage which helps the amoeba to which helps the amoeba to move from one place to the other and to capture the food, right? And when both of these functions are finished, the the pseudopodia of the amoeba disappears, right? So this is the advantage that amoeba derives by changing its shape. When we talk about shape of cell in human beings, now we have a definite shape and size. I have a particular body structure, you might have a particular body structure, but the cells that we have within our body are quite different from one another. When we talk about say an RBC, so these are the RBC, this is a nerve cell, right? And this is a muscle cell. These are the muscle cells. These are what? These are the muscle cells, right? So you can see how these three have different shapes altogether. RBC is spherical, The nerve cells have branch shape and the muscle is spindle shape. On what factors do the shape of a particular cell depends? The very first thing is the function of the cell, right? What kind of function does the cell perform determines the kind of shape it has. Now, if we take an example of an irregular shape, like when we were talking about amoeba, which was a unicellular organism which was complete in itself, had an irregular shape. In human beings, WBC, these are the white blood cells, have irregular shape. You already have studied about WBC in your previous class, and you've seen that they have a very important role in the case of immunity, right? Whenever there is an infection in the body, WBC are the cells which will fight against it. So they have an irregular shaped cell. But it is quite different from the amoeba because WBC are a part of an organism. They are not complete in itself. That means WBC are not the organism itself, right? Whereas amoeba is not dependent on anybody. It's a whole organism on its own. It's an independent organism. On the other hand, WBC is a cell of an organism, right? So they have a role in immunity, right? Now, when we talk about other cells in our body, so there are hundreds and thousands and billions of cells in our body, and each cell has a different shape. Now, again, like I said, why do they have different shape? It depends on the function, right? Depends on the function of the cell, right? What kind of function does the cell perform? Accordingly, the shape of the cell is determined. Now, if we talk about, say, if we talk about the nerve cells, these cells receive messages, they transfer messages, and that's why they are elongated, right? Usual shape that we see, the different shapes that we see in the cells are round, elliptical, round, spherical. We see elongated, right? There's some kinds of shapes that we are seeing in the regular shapes that we are seeing in the body of one or the other organisms, right? These cells, you can say some of the cells are pointed on both the sides, like your muscle cells, which are spindle shaped, right? As you can see, these are pointed on both these sides, right? This is spindle shaped cells. We can write it as spindle shaped cells, right? Now, again, remember students, when these cells are, why these cells are spindle shaped? Because they have a particular function. Similarly, always remember the function of the cell defines the kind of shape it has. Now, if we talk about the nerve cell, they are first of all branched, right? Then you can see the cells are long. The reason is, what is their function? Their function is to transfer and receive messages. Transfer and receive messages, right? What kind of messages do they receive? They receive the messages from the brain and they transfer it to the organs. So there are two-way function of a nerve cell. So there is a two-way function of the nerve cell, that is receiving. So if we talk about a nerve cell, so what it does is that it is a communication system between the brain and the organs, or maybe we can also call it as muscles of the organs, right? So when we talk about receiving, so for example, let's take a very simple example, that if you touch a hot object, right, then what you do is you remove your hand immediately. How does this message, how do you remove your hand? Because from your skin, the message is relayed to your spinal cord, right? And suppose when I'm writing, I can see maybe that, okay, this, this thread is wrapped around my pen. I want to remove it, right? This message was sent from my eyes to my brain. So this was sending of the message where the nerve cell was, involved. when the brain saw that, okay, what function has to be done, it will again relay the message from the brain. The message will be taken by the nerve cell and it will be sent to the muscles. So in this way we see how the messages is being transferred from brain to the body, right? Different parts of the body, different organs, and all of this relaying of the messages, that is receiving and transferring the messages, occurs because with the help of nerve cells, right? So nerve cell, because they play such an important role, that's why they are long, so that quick transfer of messages can take place. We do not want the transfer to be delayed, because suppose if there was small cells, right, it was not a long cell, it was a small cell, what would happen? The transfer of the information would take place slowly. Thus, it would be harmful for the organism, and that's the reason why the nerve cell are developed, or the shape of the nerve cell is such that it has a long shape, it is branched, thus helps in quick transference of the messages, right? So when we talk about the shape of the cell, what do you think gives the shape of the cell? When I say the shape of RBC is spherical, it is disc-like. So how does this shape is maintained? What is the part that maintains the cell, the shape of the cell? So that is cell membrane. So cell membrane helps in the maintenance of the shape of the cell, right? It is the outermost covering. All the cells are cell membrane. So all the cells are bound or enclosed in the outer membrane, which gives it the shape. Cell membrane is present in all the animals and plant cells. But when we talk about plant cell, there is an extra or additional covering called as the cell wall, right? This is quite a thick covering which is present in the plant cell, and this is one of the ways in which we differentiate the animal and plant cell. This is outer protective covering. It is quite thick and is only seen in the plant cells and some bacterial cells. When we talk about the cell membrane, it is present in both plant and animal cells. Regarding this, you will study more when we will go to the parts of the cell. For now, it is important for us to understand that cell membrane maintains the shape of the animal cells and plant cells, and cell wall is an extra covering which provides rigidity and protection to the plant cell, right? So this is all about the shape of cell. In this session, we are going to talk about the size of the cell. If you remember, in the previous session, we talked about the number and the shape of the cell. Now, we'll talk about size of the cell. Now, as you saw that how the shape of the cell varied according to the function, and there were various shapes of the cell. Similarly, the size of the cell also varies from a millionth of a meter, that is your micron, to a few centimeters, right? So the size of the cell varies a lot, right? They may be as small as, like I said, micron or a micrometer, or it can be as large as a few centimeters, right? The largest cell that we know is measuring of the size, that is 17 mm into 130 mm, which is the egg of an ostrich. So this is the largest cell which we've already discussed, and it is visible with the help of without any microscope, that is with the unaided eyes, right? Whereas the smallest cell is 0.1 to 0.5 micrometer, and that is a bacterial cell, right, called as the mycoplasma, right? So in this particular example only, you can see how varied is the size of the cell, right? Again, many cells, most of the cells rather, are not visible to the naked eye. They are microscopic. That means we need microscope to visualize a cell, right? Then if you might wonder that are there any cells which are there, which we can look at and understand, look at their structure without the help of a microscope? Those are the eggs of hen, or say a ostrich, right? Those are the cells which we are able to see with the help of unaided eyes, right? Now, understand that when we are talking about the size of the cell, the structure or the size of the organism does not matter. How is it related? We'll understand that. But before we move on, let's do an activity in which what we are going to do is we are going to boil an egg, and then we are going to observe its shape, and what are how we are classifying this egg as an egg, as this egg as in cell, we'll understand, right? So what we are going to do, first of all, we will remove the shell, right? Remove the hard shell which is there, and then we will observe it. What we are going to observe is the white material. This is the white material which is surrounding the yellow part. This is the white material which surrounds the yellow part. We all know what is a yellow part. It is called as this yellow part is called as the yolk of the cell, right? Now, when what we do is when we are boiling the egg, what happens? This white matter, which is the albumin, this solidifies, right? And this albumin becomes solid, and this is the part most of the people eat. Many people do not like eating yolk, but again, this is quite a healthy diet, and that's why everybody includes it in their diet. So the main reason why we are doing this activity is to observe that how this is a part of a single cell. So both the yolk and the albumin are the part of a single cell, and with the help of this activity you are actually observing a single cell. And how is the single cell formed, and what is the procedure, that you will study in your in your chapters, that is reproduction, right? So in that chapter you're going to study that why are we calling the egg as a single cell, right? So for now, understand this cell has two parts, that is yolk, which is the yellow part, and other is the albumin, which is your white part, and it gets solidified on heating or boiling. Now, the question arises, are the cells in an elephant larger than the cells in a rat? Now, when we were talking about the shape of the cell, we said that the shape dependent on the functions. But when we are talking about the size of the cell, is size dependent upon the size of of the animal? Now, if we talk about rat and if we talk about the elephant, we know the size difference is huge. So whether the size of the rat's nerve cell will be smaller than the size of the elephant's nerve cell, this is not the case. The size of the cell is not dependent on the size of the animal. Definitely understand that the function of the nerve cell is the same whether it is in the rat, in human, in dog, cat or elephant. The function is to transport or relay the messages to and fro from the brain, right? So when we are talking about the size of the nerve cell in the case of an elephant, it doesn't vary. The only difference can be the number can be more. Instead of, say, for example, say 100 million, it can be, say, a billion of it, or 2 billions of it. Whereas in the rat, there might be only a few thousands, right? So the size of the cell will not vary, only the number will vary depending on the size of the animal. Also, the function that they perform will be similar. The nerve cell is conducting the transfer, or it is conducting the messages from the brain. This will remain the same. This will not change, right? So in this way, we see that the size is not dependent on the organism, and there is an immense variety in the size of the organisms, right? Now, once we have understood this,